My name is Varia Gorin, and I am a clinical associate professor of marketing at NYU School of Professional Studies. And I'm also the interim academic director for the Integrated Marketing and Communications Department in the Division of Programs in Business. Now, that was a long title, so to speak, for our school and department. I wanted to start briefly by giving you an introduction and background to our department before I will introduce our panelists and basically my colleague Paul Lin and our guest Stéphane Wilmet. So again, to give you a brief background, we are a diverse and a very global community of students, of scholars, of educators and professionals. In our department, we strongly believe that brands and professionals in marketing and PR have a key role to play in driving business growth. And we hold a responsibility in positively influencing societies, economies in a sustainable and equitable way. And our practice of marketing and PR is both human-centered and data-driven. And that's really kind of at the foundation of our program and curriculum. So with that very brief background, I would like to welcome you to our Lessons from China series. So the Lessons from China series is about exploring the transformation of marketing and PR from one of the most dynamic and relevant countries in terms of scale and revenue for global brands. And I'm so incredibly proud to tell you that this is the fourth season of this dynamic series. These virtual series or these sessions are meant to build bridges in business and to see what we can learn about innovation and brands from the largest consumer market in the world. We look at how consumers communicate with each other, how brands interact with their customers, and we also look at business models of big tech companies that do not include the Western tech giants like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. So this important series really helps bring some insights and understanding and learnings from China to the rest of the world. And what can we learn from the future of brands in this and from this fast-moving market? So as I mentioned before, I am joined today by my colleague Paul Lim, and so honored to welcome our guest Stéphane Wilmet. Quick intro, my colleague Paul, who I will hand it over shortly, actually initiated these series. He is a highly experienced and innovative marketing executive who is also teaching in our program. He is a brilliant strategist, a brand marketer, a savvy digital thinker, and a very accomplished leader who has held senior level positions at BBDO, Saatchi, and Saatchi, just to name a few. And Stéphane, again, we're so happy to welcome him. He was formerly the Chief Consumer Officer at L'Oreal in China and currently the Senior VP Business Development at L'Oreal here in New York. And with that said, I'm actually going to hand it over to you, Paul, to lead the session this evening or this morning.
Welcome, everyone. As Varia said, this is the fourth season that we've done this, and it's always been interesting, right? In terms of where China is globally around the world. China is obviously a big part of the news right now, but the way that we have framed this and the way that we started this program was really focused on business, right? As a way to bridge to continents, to bridge to markets, to bridge two of the largest sort of consumer markets and innovation markets that are happening currently right now in the world. If you open up, you know, the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or FT, there's always something about China, you know, obviously politically, but then there's always something around it from a technology and a business standpoint, right? And you cannot, you know, if you work in a very, and NYU's, our programs are very globalized, right? And the way that I've set up my classes are very much globalized in terms of East meets West, in terms of how Chinese platforms and Chinese consumers interact on those platforms with brands. And then I always give an offshoot in terms of what that means for Westerners, or how people in the West, or how, you know, if Mark Zuckerberg sat in my class, what he can learn from what's happening on Tencent, or what's happening on Alibaba, or what's happening with social commerce in this market. All right. And so that was the genesis of how this session or these sessions came about. And our whole mandate was to bring in thought leaders and experts in the industry, which is where, you know, Stéphane sort of comes in, right? This is the first series, the first, call it, episode within our 4th season, right? And so we're really happy to sort of evolve this talk and sort of always give updates in terms of what's happening, because we know that there's a lot of students that are from China that are studying at NYU that are part of the program, and a lot of them are coming back. But then there are a lot of students also that are based in New York that have an understanding of where China is, but don't really have the details and the nuances. And so our whole thing is to bring in experts to help guide the community and guide faculty and students through that process. Okay, Stéphane is someone that I've actually known virtually for a while now, and it's interesting that we're meeting via Zoom, even though I found out that he has seen me come and talk in person, but never really introduced himself. But it's always good to sort of be a part of this, because he's someone that I've seen and I've respected, and he, you know, had a very esteemed position being in China for a long period of time with one of the largest beauty brands globally around the world, but one of the largest beauty brands and cosmetic brands in China, right? And if you have ever been in this market, it is, you know, beauty and cosmetic is huge, right? In terms of just the size, in terms of the innovation, and in terms of how brands need to adapt to Chinese tastes, because they're very different than what you're seeing around some of the other markets in the world, all right? Baria did a little bit of intro. Again, Stéphane is someone that I highly respect, and someone that I think will bring a lot of insights. So on that note, Stéphane, welcome, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. So good morning, Shanghai. Good evening, New York, and hello to everyone who's in a different time zone. Very happy to join all of you students at the School of Professional Studies. Thank you, Baria, and thank you, Paul, for inviting me to this session. I'm going to speak about 25 minutes. I'm going to try to cover quickly some topics and leave time for discussion. As part of the lessons from China, just one word about what my talk will be and what it will not be. This is not what L'Oreal thinks about lessons from China, or I'm not here representing L'Oreal to tell you what L'Oreal or L'Oreal China, or it's more my observations, having worked and lived in China for many, many, many years over different times, in the hope that they can be of interest, knowing, as Paul and Baria just said, that many of you are from China or have worked in China. So hopefully during the Q&A session, maybe you'll want to contradict me or share your point of view, and everything is absolutely welcome. If just because Paul said one of the largest beauty company, I just want to update everyone. L'Oreal is the largest beauty company, and by far, and number one in every market it competes. It's a very competitive company. If you want to know more about L'Oreal and how it works and its mission to create the beauty that moves the world, this image here is a teaser from the latest publicly available annual report. I invite you to go find out more about L'Oreal and its phenomenal success, including in China. And so as part of the lessons from China, I want to focus on maybe 3 lessons I can share about what we can learn from Chinese consumers. And I'm going to second what Paul just said. I think for all of you, wherever you will work, maybe you'll never set foot in China, maybe you will, maybe you'll work with Chinese companies, maybe you will not. But it's very obvious to me that one way or another, you're going to be influenced by what's happening in China, and what's happening in China is what's really driving Chinese consumers. And I'm going to try to elaborate on these points. Not to go into the details of how big China is and when it will overtake the US, etc. But just because, as you've learned from other guest speakers in previous sessions, China is a highly, highly, highly mobile powered and digitalized economy with all kinds of platforms, all kinds of ecosystems supporting many different groups of consumers, and it's a market where Gen Z or millennials or these kind of like overall classifications don't mean anything. You have to dive much deeper into smaller groups at the scale of China, but smaller groups powered by different types of technologies and platforms and communities to see what's happening. And what is happening today is, in my opinion, what's going to happen in maybe 3, 4, 5, 10 years in other markets. First lesson, you've heard this from previous speakers. I want to stress CC stands for Chinese consumers and SNS stands for speed and scale. And I try to illustrate it visually. It's very hard for those of you who have not been to China, have not lived in China. Let me take an example of Amazon, which we all know built a very successful ecosystem. You know how it makes its money with the Amazon Web Services. You know that in the US, it's a very, very dominant player. It's the dominant player in e-commerce. As big and scaled as Amazon is in e-commerce in the US, it's a very small player compared to one player of China, Alibaba. But then you see number 3, JD.com, and then there are many others. So just for those of you who have already heard this from other speakers, just keep in mind that this is a market where consumers are all about scale and all about speed, and how these platforms, including e-commerce, play. And this explains, I think you've seen this chart. It's a chart from McKinsey, I believe from 2019. It was shared by one of the previous speakers. So 2019, it's probably based on data that McKinsey looked at in 2018, 2019. So it's old data, at least old by the bench of what's happening in China. And if you just look at one group of numbers here, there's 8% of apparently consumers in their journey who are purely online and 7 who are purely offline. In other words, there are 15% of consumers who are either online or either offline. That's a theoretical number. I would like to meet just maybe one of these consumers. I don't really know who they are and where they are. Many, many years ago, before this omni-channel concept became important in other markets, it was a reality in China in the early 2010, 11, 12, as the digital dimension and life of consumers took off. So you look at what's happening, you know what's going to happen maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now. E-commerce is not only transactional, it hasn't been transactional for a very long time in China, but when you see the number of the GMV here of China, you just have to imagine in terms of consumers placing orders and the enormity of that scale and the speed at which it's developing in terms of units, in terms of people, in terms of consumer, just explains why in China on WeChat, you have all these brands here. I took some luxury brands coming up with video games to play in their engagement with these consumers who are constantly online. And that's probably going to come to other markets at some point if the technology to engage consumer, for consumers to engage a brand and for a brand to engage a consumers are there to support this a very important trait, this link between a consumer and her or his brand of reference. That's why short video formats existed in China before the world discovered TikTok. I know you had many speakers discuss this. Here's a picture, maybe some of you can recognize that it's or maybe you've seen this, it's a giant garden somewhere in a rural part of China where the trees were cut in a way to create a giant QR code. So I think this was in the mid 2010 somewhere. Again, so if villagers in a rural part of China were already representing QR codes accelerated by the coming of COVID and other markets, I think you get my point that what's happening in China today will happen in other markets. And you know the technology battle between near field communication, where you approach your smartphone from a device, then you need a chip and it's costly. Between that technology and your camera, where you just scan a QR code, and if you go to Africa or anywhere else in Asia, and more so in quote unquote developed market, you see how the battle is tilting towards QR codes. So speed and scale. Let me give you one example, way outside of beauty, in the car industry, in the EV. And just look at the big numbers here. If you look at all the number of EV cars that were sold in last year in China, and you add up all the cars, EV cars sold in any other market, US plus Germany plus UK plus France plus place, blah, 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 China sells way more of those cars than all the other markets combined. Now this, of course, speaks to the pace of adoption of new technologies and new ideas, but it also speaks to the reality of when consumers adopt something very quickly. It's not that they're more into sustainability than other consumers, etc. They're just working with available technologies. And if a car is just a smartphone with four wheels, you can have small cars, big cars, luxury cars, accessible cars, etc. But the speed at which consumers will want the best, and the best includes sustainability today, tells you about why this is a fabulous market to test new ideas, new products. But they have to be the best in every way possible, and they have to be supported by technologies. And not only that, but it's also interesting if you look into the car, how these Chinese car makers who are now dominating this field, not only work in the car itself, but upstream and downstream from that industry. But this may be for another discussion. The second point I want to speak about, that a lesson for me, is I think China is the market to really understand very concretely how one builds brand equity, but in a digital world. You've had speakers share with you some of their findings. So let me just say that I'm not here to tell you what brand or branding or brand equity is. You have fabulous speakers and teachers and resources at NYU. But what is interesting in China is that you can confront the academic point of view on branding with the reality from these Chinese consumers. And the discussion in China is way more acute, I think, than in other markets, between what we do in terms of the product itself versus the brand. The difference between product and brand, where you invest more onto product, more on brand. How? Building awareness of a brand, but then what about the products? Focusing on the products, but then what about the brand? And whether or not it is as simple as this kind of illustration between a product, what a product is versus what a brand is. And not only that, but what the brand experience, what the brand wants its experience to be, and what the consumers perceive the experience to be. And there's no other market that's so competitive, so sophisticated to test all these principles. And so, of course, China has a very old brands that's been around for centuries, but most of its brands are new brands that were born out of the smartphones, that were born out of the screens. They may have an offline reality, they may have an online reality. In general, it's not O to O, it's O plus O. It's consumers with their phones in a store, and the store can be online or offline and both. And all these brands, they didn't exist, and then suddenly they exist. This drink brand, many Chinese people, of course, will know it. Really challenging Coca-Cola. or this coffee, new brand, didn't exist, suddenly exists, challenging Nespresso, and et cetera, in every field. Let me give you an example in beauty of a brand that's actually new, relatively speaking, maybe 4 years, did not exist, suddenly exists in makeup with a point of view inspired by the city of Hangzhou in the east of China that's considered in poetry and literature and philosophy and arts and many other dimensions to be really representing a certain ideal of beauty. And so this is a brand, a Chinese brand that has a point of view on Chinese beauty. What is Chinese beauty that some consumers may like, that some consumers may not like, but where, contrary to many other brands that focus only or mostly on products, focuses on great product needs and on the branding in a consistent manner. Starting from the product, working with influencers in terms of collaboration and activation, with a fabulous base of what we call, but it's too simple, a CRM. And all this feeds the brand. And then in a second time, the brand feeds back the product, the influencers, and the relation. And this means that in China, you can see brand equity in terms of the legacy, and you can kind of glimpse what will be the new equities. And what you see in China, again, is what will be coming to other markets, but you just see it in a much more acute and fast appearance. For the sake of time, I'm just going to go very quickly, but imagine you're in charge of Maybelline, and Maybelline is one of the most successful brands of L'Oreal, leader in makeup everywhere around the world. It's Maybelline New York. And New York means a lot of things, maybe for consumers in some of the more Western markets. But what if in China, New York doesn't mean the same thing? What if China has many cities, hundreds of cities with millions of people, new cities full of vibrance, lifestyles, skyscrapers, and modernity, maybe more clean, maybe more advanced than New York? And you're called Maybelline New York. How do you adapt your brand? You're not going to change Maybelline New York to Maybelline Shanghai, but you're going to work on how do I communicate the equity of New York in a way that Chinese people who live in these new, super modern cities can understand. And this leads to working on maybe neighborhoods and lifestyles, and not the yellow taxis and the traditional images of New York, but more a certain standpoint on beauty from a neighborhood point of view. And what we do in China can then feed the brand globally. So innovations, not just in products, not just in technologies, but also in how a brand will express itself to its consumers when speaking about beauty and the evolving trends of beauty. And then the last lesson I want to touch upon that is for me the most recent lesson learned in China is, for instance, if you work in M&A, in mergers and acquisitions, and you're working with teams on what could be the new brands or the new trends to look at, you have a lot of many different tools to work from. You do your own internal analysis, brand portfolio analysis, a gap analysis. You work with the operators and the different teams on what we need, what's out there, etc. There's many tools available. Interestingly, and it's not just for China, but interestingly, you look at what Chinese consumers are looking at. You look at what Chinese consumers are talking about. You look at what are the brands or the technologies or the new channels of communication, of engagement that Chinese consumers are talking about. And this is not only about, new brands and new trends in China, but because, and especially in beauty, where Chinese consumers are so sophisticated, and their level of knowledge of what's happening about brands that may not yet be sold or readily accessible in China, that level is so high. Just by trying to understand the point of view of Chinese consumers on what's happening, you can spot really interesting brands. And this is, I'm just going to share an example of a brand that is a Korean brand at a time when maybe Korean beauty, K-beauty, was a little on the decline. You know, there are many great Korean brands, and Korean beauty is a great source of innovation, but it had a moment, and then at least in China, it's not as strong as it was before. But when you look at what Chinese consumers are looking at in terms of Chinese beauty, you see that they're very interested in a lifestyle brand called Style Nanda, which is a brand that sells beauty and fashion. That speaks to a certain lifestyle that is not your typical K-beauty brand, but still has a point of view on beauty. And with this in mind, thinking about what Chinese consumers have spotted leads us to, leads L'Oreal to look at a brand that maybe was not the brand that that L'Oreal in Korea was mostly looking at. It was part of all the brands that we're looking at, but then you bring the point of view of Chinese consumers, and then it's interesting not just for Korea and not just for China, but for Japan. And for those of you who know the dynamics between in business between Japan and Korea, for a Korean brand to succeed in Japan here, or in Thailand, or in China, etc. So this is a lesson that I've learned, third lesson that I wanted to share with you on listening to Chinese consumers to find out the latest trends happening around the world in beauty. And in conclusions, in terms of takeaways or considerations, whatever you will be doing after you finish this program, may I strongly recommend that you try to work in China, work with Chinese colleagues, learn from Chinese consumers, put your Chinese glasses on to just see what's happening in China. May or may not help you at first, but it's a real source of inspiration. And if you know this visual, there's always this way, there's that way, there's the other way, and there's the Chinese way, which is a mix of all these ways. And it's usually before this sign. It's upstream of this sign. And with this, it is 8:30, and I'm going to hand it back to Paul and pause the sharing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stéphane. That was really insightful. And I think if for a lot of people that haven't gone through a China landscape type session, that was a really, really good one that you put together, Stéphane. Very visual, very story oriented. So let me ask you, right? You know, this whole series is really called Lessons from China, right? And what we can learn. And you sort of added bits throughout your presentation, right? And a lot of when I work with multinationals, some of the pushback I get from people from New York and London is, hey, you know, we don't have mobile payment, right? We don't have a super app, right? So we can't implement a lot of those things. So how do you take, you know, a lot of what you're saying from a China perspective, because, you know, I'm based in this market, I agree with you, but how do you, you know, what are you sort of telling your, you know, how does someone in New York implement a lot of the things that you're seeing here? Because it can't just be a straight cut and paste, right? What sort of, you know, what are you sort of itemizing or prioritizing or thinking like, you know, because I know that you're very analytical. How are you sort of, what are you telling your colleagues in headquarters and in other markets, and some of the things that some of our faculty or students can learn from that is a little bit more action oriented?
I think for our colleagues in France or New York or Tokyo or Korea or many other places that work on brands that are global brands, they don't just really need to listen to us because they're always in China. Obviously not these days because of some COVID-related restrictions, but they're always in China. They're all, because when they're working on the brand, on the products, on the services, on the technologies, on their evolving beauty vision, they have the Chinese consumer in mind. So it's not like China's out there and they do what they want and then somebody else does some. It's probably the largest or soon to be largest beauty market, and skincare it is. I know we had another speaker in your series who explained the beauty market, so I'm not going to go back and explain, but knowing that if you look at the latest published data on the Chinese beauty market, I think the market was negative. Most, if not all, competitors were negative, and L'Oreal was double-digit positive. And so that just means that everyone, be they in China or not in China, is acutely listening, learning every day from China, from being in China, from listening to consumers, from the Chinese teams that are in their teams in wherever they are.
Yep.
That would be my answer, Paul.
Okay, great.
Stéphane,
Yes.
another question is around kind of different categories, right? Kind of, we can have, for example, you spoke about the beauty industry and the car industry. And, you know, one could argue that there are certain categories where we see more global insights, global consumer insights. Those products or services lend themselves more for a global approach. For example, food is more of a localized category, typically. Do you think that is true, or is that an old way of thinking? Can kind of, do you think all categories can learn, because it's not just a product, it's about, as you mentioned in your presentation, delivery and how people buy, etc. Or do you think there is a differentiation there? What are your thoughts?
I think one of the characteristics of the fast-moving consumer markets in China, and something that Paul really stresses a lot in the different medium that he's involved with in NYU, is how young the consumers are. So if you were to bench the user of product blah blah in another market and in China, a lot of the innovation is driven by the latest new cohort of consumers. And so they bring new aspirations, they bring new ideals, they bring new aspirations, really like where they want to go. And with that come new platforms that start in China and will go global. It's not that Chinese people like short video content like TikTok or live stream. It's that you see it first with younger people in China and then it spreads. So of course, everything is local. In beauty, a lot of the innovations from China that was created with Chinese consumers in mind actually benefited consumers everywhere else. But you just have to keep in mind that the beauty routine of a Chinese consumer, how many products she or he uses in the morning, at night, cannot be compared to the much more simplified and basic beauty routine in, say, a quote unquote Western market. So there are some things that will remain very specific to the level of sophistication of consumers, but it tells you where the market can go.
Thank you.
Stéphane.
Yes.
No, it's good. Stéphane, I have a question. There's a question from Joni that she's asked, and it's a good one, right? Because it's something that that I talk a lot about in class and through a lot of the consulting I do, right? How do you, as a multinational, with different, with huge amount of staff, huge amount of processes, right? Checks and balances, compete with a more nimble, faster, lean local player, right? How does that sort of, how are you adapting to that speed, right? And that level of innovation, or the fact that, L'Oreal, I've seen a lot of sort of consumer studies where they say, kids are like, that's my mom's beauty brand, right? Mm-hmm. So how are you as a, how does your organization or, compete against local players and compete against the more cool, so to speak, cooler players that are coming out in market here?
So I think, first of all, we love competition. It's in our DNA, and it keeps us really, really engaged in staying engaged with our consumers. And so there could be instances where a brand is my mom's brand or whatever, but that would be the result of a failure. Actually, in China, in our company, most of our staff is from mainland China. They know the market, they know their consumers. There's a lot of sharing between different teams. There's a very sophisticated team that brings insights. We work with platforms. We don't think that we only us know, so we'll work with all our different partners on data to transform data into insights, and insights that are actionable concretely. About your question of nimbleness, I think MNCs, and I think L'Oréal's a demonstration of that, can work in a startup mode, be fast. If our labs are in China, our factories are in China, our teams are in China, decision can be made in China with the trust and support of the global headquarters, then we can move quickly. One point, it refers back to the second lesson I shared on branding, brand versus product, is you can move very fast on product and be very strong at product innovation. And some of our Chinese competitors are very good at that. Branding, building a brand, really anchoring the equity of a brand, that's not something you do overnight and quickly. And so I think that's how one can compete effectively. It's through superior R&I, research, innovation, product, technologies, that the product delivers the promise it makes to the consumer in terms of the ingredient, the formulation, everything, the texture, but consumers, you know, they don't only buy products, and they don't only, they use products, but they buy a brand. They love a brand, but they buy a product. So I think L'Oréal's very strong there. And Chinese brands, let's see how they evolve towards that.
Yeah, because you know, it's nice that you corrected me, right? You guys are the largest, right? And there's a level of trust when you come with that, right? And you know, your mother's brand, it's almost, there's a notion with, you know, it's been around for so long and it still has that longevity. Let me sort of flip it around, because I want to build off one of you, one of the things that you just said, right? Let's flip this, right? What are your thoughts about a Chinese brand going to overseas, right? Because I'm sure you're doing, you know, one part of it is you're doing inbound, right? And the other part I'm sure you're looking at is outbound.
Right.
How's L'Oréal sort of, what strategies are L'Oréal employing in that? Is it sort of a similar process, R&D, due diligence, consumer insights, you bring it out? Help us understand a little bit about sort of the outbound element.
Okay, I'll tell you my point of view, because again, I'm not here to share what L'Oréal thinks about taking brands from China to the world. But in my point of view, if you look over time, and Paul, you've seen it. You've seen the period when every consumer wanted a foreign brand, whatever that meant, and many Chinese brands pretended to be foreign. So it's not just foreign brands. You remember those days. And then you had like more Asian brands, and in beauty, Japan beauty, J beauty, and then K beauty. Clearly now, the Chinese brands, the C, and in beauty, the C beauty is a very, very strong cultural trend in terms of beauty vision, beauty products, beauty rituals, etc. But it's also very sophisticated. So it will speak to consumers, not just Chinese consumers, but it will speak to consumers in other markets but you know the skincare routines here. You know the level of knowledge that consumers have about ingredients and functions and benefits, etc. So you don't want to dumb down a brand when you go in another market. You want to adapt it to the needs of the other market. So I think that's where, in my opinion, there's maybe a time gap needed for consumers in other markets to be at the level at which a Chinese brand would make sense. And then, of course, there's also, if it's a Chinese brand, then what does China mean as a, not talking politically, but as a country, a culture, a reference point. You know, if you think what's Italian beauty, maybe you have a point of view. If you think what's Japanese beauty, maybe think of something. I think there's definitely a big space for Chinese beauty, but it's linked to how consumers not in China perceive China as a cultural entity. That's also a question of time. If you agree, Paul.
No, I agree. I agree. It's very fascinating, sort of this topic, and I know it will become a trend, this element around C beauty, because J beauty and K beauty are quite established, right? It's just then how does C beauty sort of take on, right? With sort of removing it away from the sort of underlying China elements that are popular in the news right now. So, Baria, do you have I know that you want to ask something.
Yeah. It's actually in line with a question that we're also seeing in the Q&A that's geared around, Shanghai and other parts of China going through zero COVID policies, which of course are impacting consumption, economic activity, consumer habits. What do you think will be the consequences for China for the rest of this year and going into 2023? What impact do you see that having in global markets? Of course, it's very hard to look into the future, but just kind of what are your thoughts on that?
Just to your point, Barry, I think if you meet somebody who tells you that he or she knows exactly what's going to happen, beware. Nobody knows. The beauty is you always learn. Every day is something new. From a Chinese consumer point of view in the Chinese market. I'm not in China, so I don't want to I'll of course want to hear what Paul thinks of this point, but I don't think COVID's going to change drastically consumers, because consumers have values, they have dreams, they have aspirations, and those don't change over time. I think, as is the case maybe in other markets, going to accelerate, or it's going to strengthen some of the trends. But it's not like people love beauty and now they don't love beauty anymore, or they were interested in beauty and now they are not. Of course, maybe the underlying elements of rationality may come to play, but COVID or no COVID, whatever beauty means to you and another consumer, that quest for beauty is very strong. Maybe more linked to health, maybe more again, rational in terms of triggers, but that deep beauty quest, a little COVID blip is not gonna, in my opinion, have structural impact. On the contrary, people have time to reflect on who they are, what they want, what's important, and always happy to be proven wrong, and I've been proven wrong many times, but the quest for beauty is something that exists in all humankind from whatever the culture. So China or not China. There could be, and a lot of people are making comments about, increased, call it nationalism, call it appreciation of one's culture. What is it called? Like decoupling or whatever at a political level. I think it's just the rediscovery for that many Chinese consumers are proudly undergoing about their own culture and the richness and vastness and depth of Chinese culture. That was there before COVID. It's accelerated through COVID. I don't think it's new and different and like, before and after.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think just to build upon what you're saying, Stéphane, I think beauty is very personal, right? It's a very universal insight, and it touches cross culturally. So, this COVID thing is I think Chinese consumption is obviously will slow down. It depends on the category, right? And that's where it comes in. I think beauty specifically is probably one that won't get touched or get impacted as much. Their growth in some categories like snacking, right, where people are stuck at home, people need some level of just happiness, right, and a bag of chips or a soda will provide that because it's a low cost item. Okay, high ticket items. I think if anything with COVID is the challenges with duty free stores around the world, because there are no Chinese tourists and consumers going through them, right? And we're hearing, I'm reading a lot about high streets in Paris and in London and New York, which have to compensate for the lack of tourism that's coming from China to those markets where a lot of the consumption was shopping and luxury goods. Okay, so I think that's an impact, and it's something that I've heard from people that work in that sector. That will get affected. All right. Let me just sort of take a question from Alice in here, and it's a really fascinating one around just influencers and celebrities. Okay, and again, it's not a universal, it's not a China thing, right? Instagram influencers, $1 million for a post by the Kardashians, right? And if I feel like there is a huge amount of, and it's hard for me because as a strategist, I always like to start off the very beginning, right? Brand equity proposition, and then get down to tactics, where I sit in meetings here and it's like, let's just start, the first question is which KOL can we use, right? Key influencer, right? How do you guys choose that? What's the decision-making process that, again, I know you don't want to say it's from L'Oreal, but from your perspective as an expert, right, especially in beauty, which is very much affected by recommendations and what other people are using, how should you're entering the field? How should brands approach influencers, and in terms of choosing them, in terms of criteria, in terms of decision making, Stéphane?
I think that it's also an example of what Chinese consumers have taught us that is now we're seeing elsewhere. One of your recent speakers was sharing about in the discovery, interest, purchase journey of a consumer, how trust is at the center now of a shortened or adjacent discovery and not linear. The gentleman from Kantar. And so if you take this in mind, that trust is at the core of this journey, shortened journey, online journey, a discovery journey. Many of these influencers have a level of expertise and knowledge in not just beauty in general, but a category of beauty, brands, products, formula, ingredients, combination of ingredients, concentration of actives in a formula, that they built trust. That it's not just they're funny to watch or it's an entertainment moment, it's an educational moment. And if you're deeply interested in beauty and you want the best for your skin, and that's what drives Chinese consumers, the quest for the best, you want to learn from people who know. And so the point is, there may have been a time when brands knew everything and other people knew less, but now if that ever existed today, knowledge is shared. And so it's up to the brands to work with influencers who are very knowledgeable, who have an audience that trusts them. They will tell us how to communicate to their audience. They will know the language, the points of interest, the points to highlight. They will challenge us. They will make us better. So, hey, I know what you mean, Paul, and you can be very transactional. You have a promotion and you want to meet a certain goal and whatever. You're not building brand equity when going down that path of choosing a celebrity for a transactional process. If you have the brand equity in mind, you want to find and establish relationships where the influencer contributes to the building of whatever it is that's part of your equity. Certainly in beauty, certainly, for instance, in skincare, knowledge is at the core of that relationship. So I think that would be my answer.
Okay.
Find the experts, work with the experts.
That's great. Thank you, Stéphane. I had a question around basically further building on what you were talking about, right? China is indeed Chinese consumers are quite advanced in adopting new technologies. China's advanced with digital commerce. You mentioned it's not really O2O, but it's more O plus O. And you referenced the car industry, for example, right? Kind of like a lot of new technologies there, new behaviors that we're seeing in the car industry, right? Kind of entertainment in the car, for example, which you see far more developed in China. What do you think is next, kind of further building on these? How do you think, technology and brands specifically in our case will continue to grow in such a super competitive market? Do you see specific signals kind of pointing in specific arenas, further building on what you presented?
I'll try to illustrate with, I was just looking up what's the latest on cars. I don't really know that industry and EV and Paul remembers the days when there were no cars in China. And now it just jumped into these latest technologies because consumers want the latest and the best. And one of the Chinese it's not an automobile, I think it's a mobility company, digital mobility company called XPeng, just premiered today in a Dubai car show, or again, I don't really know that industry, a prototype of its flying car. So my slides, I didn't have time to update them. They're like already outdated because what's new, what's next? These Chinese technology companies who know their users can see what they want. So that would be the illustration. And so what's next? More smaller groups, a stronger interaction between a brand and its consumers and the brand, but on a smaller scale, but much deeper, versus the brand that speaks to many, many, many communities. So already we see this in China, where every 3-4 years, you have very new sets of values showing up related to consumption. And then you break them down. And I think that's gonna happen. I see that coming up next, and we'll learn hopefully from China also in that regard.
Great, thank you. I'm seeing we're almost coming to the kind of in terms of we're getting short on time. So I do really want to ask a question that I know many of our students have top of mind. So a lot of our students, or many of our students, are from China and or are currently studying with us in Shanghai, and many of our students, both Chinese and non-Chinese, are interested in working for brands and agencies potentially in China. And what is your best advice to them looking for a job and preparing for a career in China? Again, I know this is a pretty broad question, but what are kind of the top things that come to mind?
I would say, obviously, the NYU students who are from China know it way better than I can ever. But for all the students who are studying or know China or live in China, work in China, want to work in China, do it. Absolutely do it. But be prepared that this is the toughest, most competitive, with the most sophisticated, where everything you've learned, and you've only learned great things at NYU, but be prepared to like challenge everything you learn, because you're going to be on a fast train moving at full speed, test, validate, invalidate, test again, validate, invalidate. So I would say grab the chance of working in China, working with Chinese colleagues, working in for Chinese consumers, but be prepared to do this in the mindset of learning. So as if NYU School of Professional Studies continued with on the ground, almost 24/7 learning, but grab that chance, because whatever you will learn, whatever you will be exposed to, even if you don't fully understand it, will tremendously help you wherever afterwards you may go. Be it that you are a Chinese student or a non-Chinese student.
Paul, any builds on that?
So much happening.
Yeah, just one bill, Stéphane. Are you what's the internship program like? Because one student is interested. She loved this presentation so much. She wants to spend her time at your organization. How is there an internship program? How do you guys sort of make that happen?
So thank you to that student for being interested. Paul, I'll let you know whom to contact. Of course, L'Oréal has a very strong internship program. I'm not aware of the latest criteria, but I'll let you know whom to contact, of course.
Okay, no problem. I think for that student and any other student that's sort of watching, you can contact us, and then we'll make sure that we get the information from Stéphane over to you in the proper manner through NYU, either email or any of the other facilities. Okay, I think we're done.
Yeah.
So we're, thank you thank you very much, everyone, for staying up. If you're in New York and the East Coast of the US, thank you for staying up. If you're here in Shanghai, good morning. Have a great day, and stay safe with, all the COVID situation that's starting to happen. Stéphane, really good to have you online and to see you here. China misses you, Shanghai misses you, right? It's not the same without sort of a thought leader like yourself in this market on the ground, making things happen. But really appreciate you sort of being a part of this journey with us here at NYU. And then Baria, really good to be hosting this with you this morning here. Okay, if anyone has any additional questions, just send it through via email, and we'll get them over to you. But I think on that note, thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day, have a good night. And Stéphane, hopefully I'll speak to you soon. Okay.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to also a special thank you to you, Stéphane, for joining us this evening. And of course, Paul, thank you very much for co-hosting. I'd like to share a few kind of announcements for our upcoming events. On October 19th, we will actually host an info session for executive masters in marketing and strategic communications. So if you are a kind of a more seasoned marketer or PR professional looking for an executive degree, please don't miss that session. Next slide, please. Then we have on October 21st, we have a book talk with Adam Ritchie about the book titled Invention in PR, and it will be hosted by our colleague, Michael Diamond. And if you enjoyed this event, we would actually love to hear from you. In any case, we'd like to hear from you, get your feedback. You will have received an email from us at this point, so please check your inbox. And if you'd like to be featured on our website with some insightful thoughts that you may have about the webinar, please again check that email and read for further details. And that concludes today's session. Thank you everyone for joining us, whether it's late in your evening or early morning. Thank you again, Stéphane and Paul, and have a great rest of your night and rest of your day.
Great, thank you everyone.